especially like the part where you're talking about why the 100-year standard, and talking about the mortgage, really doesn't describe the risk people face.
You know, I think it's a good thing and a step in the right direction that people are now trying to relate flood risk to mortgages, but I don't think it's sufficient. I don't think the idea that a 26% chance in the life of a 30-year mortgage, I don't think that hits home emotionally. It doesn't connect emotionally. But I think if you start talking about your lifetime and the fact that a standard of 100-year protection, what that means is that in the average person's lifetime, they have a better than 50% chance of having to live through or get killed by a flood much greater than a 100-year standard. If everybody in New Orleans knew that they had a better than 50% chance of experiencing Katrina, they would have insisted upon, and I think the rest of the country would have insisted upon, having a higher standard for flood protection. I think if they knew that in a 100-year period, their lifetime and their life of their child, they actually had a 26% chance of living through 2 Katrinas and having everything they own destroyed twice, then I think they would demand some action and expect it. And part of that action, of course, is on their own side. You know, they raise homes or evacuate or, various other kinds of non-structural things that they can do. But I think that's a much greater emotional hit in a message than relating it to a mortgage. But the real damage is just the idea that 100-year protection sounds so good. It sounds like forever. And of course, anyone who understands the field at all understands it's a very low standard of protection. There's this idea that a developer convinces a local government to build a levee. It's certified 100-year standard. The developer builds something. People move in. They see, oh, that's a levee against 100-year protection. We're safe, and they don't buy flood insurance. Which is a little bit absurd, because the whole reason that standard exists is to get them to buy flood insurance. Obviously, it has not worked that way.
When there are disasters, people get the idea from watching television the government's going to come in and take care of everything. It's not really the case, is it? I mean, most people get very little help from the government.
Unfortunately, a lot of people in New Orleans learn they do not get much from the government. Probably the only time the government really intervened aggressively and pretty much made everybody happy was after 9/11 in New York City. And, that really was a special circumstance.
And that was not natural.
That was not a natural disaster. Of course, neither was Katrina. Katrina was not a natural disaster. Katrina was a direct result of incompetent design of flood walls in terms of most of the city. There were parts of Louisiana and, of course, the Mississippi Gulf Coast where it was a natural disaster and where they faced an enormous storm surge as big as a tsunami. And, that part's a natural disaster. There are still things you can do to protect yourselves against, total catastrophe. But, in New Orleans, it was different because of the role of poorly designed flood walls that just collapsed in front of a storm they were supposed to defend against. Wasn't all, the people in front of, in the lower Ninth Ward, that was an issue of resilience. The idea that a flood protection system will continue to survive even when it's overtopped. What happened in the Industrial Canal, and again, the flood wall that destroyed the lower Ninth Ward just poured a 20-foot wall of water on. That flood wall worked exactly as designed. It held the water until it got to the top. The water started to overtop it, started to pour over it. It was like a waterfall. Down at the bottom, they only had grass embankment. The water ate away at the grass embankment, and that was the support for the wall, and the wall fell down, and you have those people destroyed. That was actually designed that way. They did not put enough investment into the resilience of the system. Right now they have a concrete splash pad under that wall, so when it's overtopped, it will not collapse. I think that's one of the important things going forward, not just for New Orleans, but for everywhere, that flood protection systems have much higher levels of resilience built in, much higher levels of sustainability.
People think that the coast is our greatest vulnerability area, but your point was the size of the Mississippi. Would you talk about that, the number of miles and the number of...
Certainly the greatest flooding disaster that this country could possibly face, and it has not faced it since 1927, would be a levee break on the lower Mississippi River. At Cairo, Illinois, this is after you have the Missouri River, the upper Mississippi, and the Ohio all together combining their waters. That becomes really an entirely different river. It is an enormous river. Its natural floodplain extends almost 100 miles across. In fact, it might be more than 100 miles at its absolute widest point on both banks of the river. And on several times in our history, that river has filled the entire floodplain. And the last time was in 1927. And when you could go from Vicksburg to Monroe, Louisiana, which is normally completely dry land, by boat, that is a distance of 75 miles. That's on the western side of the river. On the eastern side of the river, you could go from the river to Yazoo City, which is 50 miles due east. All that was water. You had an inland sea 100 miles across in 1927. And if there were a major levee breach on the Mississippi River, on the lower Mississippi, right now, you would pretty much get the same thing again, except the number of people living in those areas and the amount of investment in productive capacity is enormously greater than it was in 1927. And in fact, that a breach on the lower Mississippi levees would probably dwarf Katrina, both in its drama and in its ultimate national impact on things like gross national product and things like that.
And loss of life.
Possibly in loss of life as well, although river floods tend to move more slowly and you have a greater opportunity to evacuate.